It's good to go ahead and get started. And I want to thank all of you for being here. For those of you who are in Salem, one of the advantages of having Zoom webinars is that we don't have to go out in the rain. And I'm a little unused to how to be in the rain because it's been so long for us. So stay dry. Hopefully your internet will survive the massive rain, which isn't really that massive. It's just wet. So congratulations. So we'll make it through. I'm going to start off tonight's festivities. My name is Scott Pike, and I'm a professor in environmental science and archaeology here at Willamette University. I'm also the president of the Salem Society of the Archaeological Institute of America. And it's my honor and privilege to welcome all of you here. I can't see your faces, which is always a bit awkward, but I do want to welcome you and just briefly encourage you to join the AIA if you have not already. And if you have joined the AIA, to please continue your membership. These last several months since the pandemic have actually, I wouldn't say they've been a strain on the Institute at all, but I felt like our momentum has been somewhat halted. We are very much able now to do these Zoom lectures and promote archaeology and promote the great work of the speakers that we're able to bring in. And they are able to share with all of us the work that they're doing. And this is only possible if we continue our membership. So please continue, join with the membership. You'll have your subscription to Archaeology magazine.
That's Raina right there.
Sorry? Oh, the other thing I also want to mention is that this talk is also being sponsored by the Center of Ancient Studies and Archaeology at Willamette University. And it's the center and really the work of Raina Myers, who on my screen, she's on the top left. And it's her work and skills at administration that really help us put these talks on. So Raina, thank you very much. Okay, so, and if you're in a giving mood, and I know most of you are because you're enjoying the rain, if you are up to date on your membership with the AIA, we are always encouraging members to donate student memberships. We haven't been able to really canvass for student membership since the start of the pandemic. And we have a whole new slate of students coming in who are interested in the world of archaeology and ancient studies. And we would love to be able to offer them membership to this organization to get them involved with this organization and hopefully set them off on a career in archaeology. So if you have any desires to do that, please contact me. My email is very simple. It's spike or spike at willamette.edu, or you can contact Raina, who all of you or most of you have contacted to get the Zoom link. So thank you. And now I'm going to introduce Professor Rob Chenault, who has the pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Scott, and welcome everyone to our second archaeology lecture of the fall semester. My name is Rob Chenault, and I'm an associate professor of history and classical studies at Willamette University, as well as the program coordinator of the Salem AIA. To begin with a programming note, we will have our final installment of the fall lecture series 3 weeks from tonight on Thursday, November 11th at 7 p.m. This will also be a Zoom event for which we are pleased to have a talk by Dr. Morag Kersal of DePaul University, who will be speaking on From the Mound to the Mantelpiece, the movement of early Bronze Age pots from the Dead Sea Plain in Jordan. Tonight, we extend a warm digital welcome north of the border to Dr. Marcus Millwright. Dr. Millwright is professor of Islamic art and archaeology in the Department of Art History and Visual Studies at the University of Victoria in Victoria, British Columbia. He has held research fellowships at the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at Harvard and MIT, and at the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art at Shangri-La in Honolulu. His research interests include the art and archaeology of the Islamic Middle East, labor and craft practices in the urban environment, and cross-cultural contacts in the medieval Mediterranean. He is involved in archaeological and architectural fieldwork in Jordan, Syria, and Greece, and has created the Crafts of Syria website. His many books include Fortress of the Raven, Karak in the Middle Islamic Period, An Introduction to Islamic Archaeology, and The Dome of the Rock and its Umayyad Mosaic Inscriptions, as well as Islamic Arts and Crafts, an anthology, Middle Eastern Encounters, collected essays on visual, material, and textual interactions between the 8th and 21st centuries, and most recently, The Queen of Sheba's Gift, a history of the true balsam of Materea. He is currently working on the publication of early Islamic pottery from Raqqa and a website devoted to the traditional crafts of Iraq. His lecture this evening is titled The Shock of the New, Writing and the Propagation of Religious Ideology in Early Islam. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marcus Millwright.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the warm welcome. And I'd like to, just acknowledge that working with Rainer was wonderful to get this organized, and I'm enormously grateful to the AIA and Willamette University for hosting this lecture. So before I do that, I'll you would have seen these before, but I'll quickly kind of run through the images from about the AIA. So as Scott was saying, I mean, it's a terrific program, and running lectures as well as all sorts of other activities. And I've had the privilege to be able to lecture across North America on a variety of subjects, and just seeing the kind of list of others which are being done at the same time. I mean, it's an extraordinary range of material, which is people, these experts, talking about different topics across North America. And as was said, it's an opportunity to engage also with the down-to-earth aspects of archaeology, to be involved in excavations, as well as to take advantage of the publications which are sponsored, and the chance, potentially to actually go out to these extraordinary sites. I was hearing from Scott about, sort of working at Orkney, which, given that you were saying you didn't want to go out into the rain, Orkney is an interesting place to go, as I think you probably get plenty of it. But lastly, I just want to sort of say that this is sponsored. This is the George H. Forsyth Jr. Memorial Lecture, and it's a great privilege to have the chance to do that. And then lastly, as you would have already gathered, the recording is being, the lecture is going to be recorded. So without further ado, I'd like to move on to the topic itself. So first of all, I'll just say I'm, as was mentioned, I'm speaking from Victoria, and it is a great thing to be able to connect with people across the world through Zooms. So it's a different type of talking that we do to face-to-face lectures, but I think also, it gives us that chance to look at material from very diverse places as well. So I'm speaking today from the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples on the south of Vancouver Island, but I'm going to be dealing here with different sorts of indigenous voices, and particularly the role of inscriptions in understanding early Islam, and then also understanding its relationship to the past. So hence the title Shock of the New, this question of, were these images new and shocking in some way? Were they expressing something profoundly different? Or can we see them as products of a late antique environment? So I'm going to come back to that question as we sort of run through the material. So first of all, I'm going to be thinking about the emergence of Arabic. Now, one of the points to make is that, of course, Arabic as a language, it's one of a number of Semitic languages in the Middle East, and it's one which predates Islam. But the thing is that it's in relation to others such as Hebrew, Nabatean, Syriac, it's a more recent language in that we have to wait until the 3rd century before we start to find examples of inscriptions which have the grammatical basis of Arabic, even though they're still written in Nabatean script. And then we have to wait another century after that before we see Arabic being written in Arabic script. And what we have, are a very small group of inscriptions in what's known as Old Arabic. In other words, the Arabic that exists prior to the emergence of Islam in the early 7th century. And it's very much the emergence of the Quran, the divine, or the revelation, which is the sort of central aspect of the religion, and the desire to kind of write down this and other types of messages and forms of ideology, which allowed for the development of Arabic in visual terms. And so I'm going to be thinking not particularly kind of linguistically about the language, but rather about the way it's written in monumental inscriptions, and then also to some extent in coins. So what we're going to see is that there's a language which is being used to propagate sort of new ideas. And then there's also a concern with the visual qualities of that language. So that the written language, the proportionality of the scripts, that these are in some sense meaningful as well. And these are not necessarily new concerns, but the reason why they're so important is they are this crucial primary record of this emergent religion and culture. And so we need to attend very carefully to what these inscriptions have to say. So I'm showing you on the screen just to sort of to give an idea of the distribution of Old Arabic inscriptions and then other related inscriptions of the pre-Islamic period. And you can see one example on the screen, which is a lintel, which is actually a trilingual inscription with Greek, Syriac, and Arabic, all basically providing more or less the same material. And the Arabic is the one in the lowest section of the lintel. And you can see it's not tremendously well controlled. But we're going to come back to thinking about that development of Arabic in visual terms. But I think that a good starting point is to think about Arabia. And by that, I'm meaning, this very large area of the Arabian Peninsula that stretches also up into eastern Syria and western Iraq. So that sort of desert triangle, the basalt desert up at the top. That this, in late antiquity, prior to the life of the Prophet Muhammad, sort of born in about 570, and according to the Muslim tradition, having his first revelation in about 610 and then dying in 632, that this area was really beyond the boundaries of the two major dynasties of this time, the Byzantine Empire, the Christian continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, and then the Sasanian Empire in Iran. Now, what I'm going to argue is that, while we can see certain new themes coming through in the inscriptions, we also need to understand them in that sort of landscape in which they exist. So what will become apparent is that the way in which Arabic inscriptions develop in the early Islamic period rather depends on where they're located. So those located in Arabia and then into places like sort of Syria and Egypt, and I'm using Syria in its sort of larger sense here. And I'm going to contrast that at the end of the talk with what we see in the area of the Sasanian Empire, where we see different dynamics which can be related to the ways in which the Sasanian dynasty used imagery and text in propagating ideas. So before we do that, I'm showing you an example from a slightly later phase. So this dates to the late 8th or 9th century. And it's a small jug. It's made of unglazed ceramic, and it was found in Raqqa in northeastern Syria, very important site of the Abbasid dynasty. So they founded a new city there in the 770s. And this particular piece, the ceramic itself is very consistent with the types of workaday ceramics that were produced at that time. But what's happened to it is that somebody's decided after it's been manufactured to write over it in ink. So it's not glazed onto the surface or fired. It's just a post-manufacture form of decoration. And it's remarkable that it survived in such good condition. And sadly, I imagine that it's probably now destroyed because of the bombing and other damage that Raqqa has endured during the Syrian civil war. But what's so interesting about this piece is that we actually have a substantial portion of the Quran, particularly of Surah 55 or Surah Ar-Rahman, is written on here. It takes us, on the outer surface from verses 1 to 47. It then starts again around the interior of the neck, going down into it, and then it starts again at the top of the exterior of the neck, and a new set of lines is set between the existing lines, spiraling around the vessel, making it very difficult to read. But the thing is that it goes to about verse 59. So very ambitious thing to do. And in many ways, it looks forwards, in the sense that the idea of privileging writing over any other form of decoration is something, of course, we associate very much with Islamic culture, and sometimes even, whole designs where words are kind of interlocking and creating geometric forms and so on. So we could sort of see this as just being a kind of early manifestation of this preoccupation with writing. But it's a more complex vessel than this, because we can think about it sort of going backwards as well. And the practice of writing in ink and spiraling around, encircling a vessel, has magical qualities to it. We can also think about the fact that the surah itself, Surah Ar-Rahman, is an unusual one because it has a repeated refrain, which is and which of God's blessings will you both deny, which continues throughout the text. Something which makes it sound very much like a psalm, and indeed comparisons have been made between this and Psalm 113, which again has a kind of repeated refrain. We're in an area in Raqqa that actually had a strong Christian population. There were monasteries around here. So in some senses, although we're looking at an object which is obviously Muslim in the sense that it's representing the Quran, it is still doing something which might be somewhat comprehensible to a Christian audience at the same time. The other component, of course, of writing around something like this is magical. We know that Surat Ar-Rahman later was used on charms, and also there are references to bowls being written with ink and then filled with water, and then you would sort of drink it in order to ingest the words as a way of protecting yourself against plague. So that sort of magical component is picked up in amulets. And I'm showing you just some examples here, again, showing that idea of texts encircling either the edges of something or creating a kind of pattern. So part of the meaning of the text is in the content, what it actually has to say, but it's also in its format, the fact that it encircles and encloses something. So this is going to be important to us because we need to think about these inscriptions that we're going to look at, not merely as means to project information, but also that their form may actually be a communicative device. Now, if we go, so these are examples of later amulets, but if we go backwards, we can find the same processes. We've got an example of a late antique bronze amulet with Greek inscriptions around the outside. And then these wonderful bowls, they're known as Aramaic incantation bowls. They were found in Nippur in Iraq, dated to the 5th to the 7th century. And what we have here are spiraling inscriptions which enclose a central, usually an image of a sort of deity. And the idea is that it's a way of kind of keeping that malign deity enclosed within the words to protect you. So the reason I'm using this example is it shows how we have to constantly be looking forward and backwards, in a sense. We shouldn't just think about these inscriptions as information about what Islam is going to become, but rather try and place them in their own time as to how they might have communicated to different audiences. So this kind of brings up, a really central question is, well, why would we spend time on these inscriptions when we have in Arabic masses of primary sources? If we want to understand the history of the Islamic conquests, and here we've got a map that shows, over the course of about a century, from the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 through to the 730s, there was the creation of a continuous land empire that took us from the Atlantic coast of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula through North Africa into the Middle East, and then through to the borders of Tang Dynasty China in Central Asia, and the northern borders of the Indian subcontinent. Now, if we read a historian like Tabari writing in the 9th century, he's created a history which in its printed version now is over 30 volumes long, masses of information. But the central problem is that when we're dealing with the early period, so I'm talking about the first century of Islam, running from 622 through to sort of about 720, is that we don't have primary kind of historical sources from this period. They're all later. And the result of this is that if we want to understand what people in the 9th century understood the 7th century to be, we've got masses of material. But if we actually want to know what was going on in the 7th century, we just have a complete absence of those sorts of chronicles and standard historical sources. We have the Quran, which we can date fairly confidently in the main to the 7th century. We have some papyri with administrative material. But the thing is that other things like the hadith, the sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, were all collected later. And it's not to say that some of them are not from the 7th century. It's just trying to work out what is that 7th century core of that documentation. So what this means is that trying to understand what early Islam actually was for the people who were involved in it is tremendously complicated because of this tendency in later sources to regularize the material. Anything that didn't fit, they tended to sort of discount it, and so we've lost that. But this is where the inscriptions come in, because we have a whole series of dated inscriptions which we can confidently date from about 640s through to 640s through to into the 8th century. And so I'm going to be showing you some of these and really trying to pull out some of the main themes from them. And I'm going to use that then to come back to this question of, are they entirely new in what they're doing, or are they rooted in some important ways in this sort of late antique, particularly Christian landscape? So I'm showing on the screen two important inscriptions. One on the left is is the earliest sort of rock inscription to survive that actually has a date on it, or at least it's, yes, this is dated 420, 24 of the Hijra. So this is the dating system that develops, which starts in 622 and then is based on lunar years. So what we have on here is from Saudi Arabia, in the northern part of Saudi Arabia, and it says, I, Zuhair, wrote this at the time Umar died in the year 420. Very short inscription, but the thing is that it has important elements to it. It starts with a phrase, Bismillah, in the name of God. And this can be lengthened as Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. And this is a phrase which is used in all sort of early inscriptions at the beginning. And it's also the phrase which is used at the beginning of all but one of the surahs of the Quran. So it does have a kind of distinct religious connotation. But what we also have is this reference to Umar. Now, no other information is given about him, but it's clear from the context of the year is that what's being referred to is the second caliph of the Islamic world, Umar ibn al-Khattab. And he died in the last day of 24 and was buried in the first day of 25. But notice that he isn't given a title. There's no reference to a caliph, or indeed, as we'll see later on, there are no references here to the Prophet Muhammad, to the religion of Islam. And these are things that we'll see elsewhere, is that a lot of the things that become very standard later on are absent from these early inscriptions. So from a rather later, we have this dam from Taif, which is associated with the Caliph Muawiyah, and he ruled between 661 and 680. And we've already got more information here. So it gives him his title. We see him being called Amir al-Mu'minin, or Commander of the Faithful. We've got information about other people involved in the building of this project. So as we would expect, we've got a certain degree of evolution through these early decades. But again, worth thinking about what is absent here. In a later inscription, we would expect references to Muslims. There's no reference to a Muslim as an individual until probably the 680s, 690s. There's no reference to Islam as a religion. Now, that's not to say those things didn't exist, but the thing is that they weren't evidently felt appropriate to put in an inscription. Now, we've got two fascinating examples here. One is a gravestone which dates to 652. So we're only looking at 30 years after the death of the Prophet, 20 years after the death of the Prophet. And in it, we have the Bismillah up at the top in its longer form, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And then we've got a phrase in it, bring him into your mercy, which is the bit that I've highlighted. And then it sort of gives us also the Hijra date. Now, the reason why I'm highlighting that is that this is a kind of broadly kind of salvific expression, but it does have a relationship to Quranic Arabic. Now, it's not a direct quote from the Quran, but it has a sort of Quranic quality to it. Now, the other one is a more sort of extensive inscription, and you can also see how the Arabic itself has kind of improved in terms of its proportionality and the working out of the lines. It's a less crude piece. And this one comes from near the great pilgrimage site of Kabbalah in Iraq. Now, the reason why I'm pointing this one out is that it has this really interesting reference to Gabriel, Michael, and Israfil. So it's referencing archangels, and again, it's an inscription that asks for salvation. And then there's this also very interesting expression that you can see as well, Rab al-Alamin, meaning Lord of the Worlds. Now, this is an inscription. This is a phrase which actually does come from the Quran, and so whether it is meant as a quotation from the Quran or whether it was something in kind of general usage is more difficult to say. But the point is that this is sort of half a sentence or verse within a Quranic passage. Now I'm going to come back. It's worth kind of thinking about those references to the archangels, because I'll come back to that later on. Now, in these inscriptions, to say, one of the really interesting things is the absence of specific references to the Prophet Muhammad. Now, one would imagine those would be all over the place in early inscriptions, but they're not. And we do have, though, references to the idea of the prophet appearing in this inscription, which may date to the 650s or possibly to 670s. And as you can see, it says, protection of God, Dhimat-Allah, and guarantee of his messenger or prophet. So this would appear to be a reference to the Prophet Muhammad. And this idea of dhimma is something which has a Quranic resonance, and it appears also in early papyri, like the one that you can see on the screen. So I'm running, as I say, through these, fairly quickly. I mean, each one we could talk about for a long time, but I'm trying to give you the kind of broad context of what's going on. So we have this phrase, Bismillah, which is sometimes called the invocation. But the other thing, which of course is absolutely fundamental to Islam, and is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, is the profession of faith, what later becomes called the Shahada. And this profession of faith, as it exists now, is La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. And there are variants on that, but essentially there is no God but God. Muhammad is the prophet of God, or the messenger of God. But the thing is that it takes on a very standard form by the time we get to the 8th century. But we do have interesting texts and inscriptions that suggest a degree of kind of variation in this. Now, the fundamental thing is to assert the oneness of God, that it's obviously makes it a distinction from paganism on one side, and then also the idea of the Christian Trinity on the other, and then the prophethood of Muhammad. Now, what we do find is intriguing evidence that there were variants on this. And I'm showing a text from the History of the Patriarchs. This is a Christian text produced in Egypt. And it says about the governor of, Muslim governor of Egypt in 680s. And he decides that churches, that they're going to put on it an inscription that says, Muhammad is the great messenger of God, and Jesus is also the messenger of God. But verily, God is not begotten and does not beget. And this actually it picks up on Quranic phrases, but you can see it's a rather different type of profession. And then we also have this undated inscription that I'm showing you, where it says, I testify there is no God but God. I testify Muhammad is his servant and his messenger, and thy mercy, O God, there is no God but him. God is my trust and he is the Lord. So it suggests sort of levels of experimentation within this really central phrase within Islam. Now, where this goes is that we need to think about the context in which these phrases are happening. We start to see on coins that they're experimenting with these phrases like Bismillah, and then they elaborate it sometimes with names of God. And these, of course, are public things. They're circulated broadly. Of course, one would need to be literate to kind of understand them properly. But the thing is that on coins, what we see, the coin image is done in a kind of Sasanian style, but it has Arabic and then also Middle Persian inscriptions on it. And the Middle Persian inscription on the reverse is really interesting, because this is the first time that we see an identifiable shahada, saying there is no God but God, Muhammad is the prophet of God, except it's not actually written in Arabic in this case. But we have to wait a little bit, from the same time, in fact, from 691, we have an inscription, and I'm showing that on the other side, which was made for a woman called Abasa bint Jurayj. Now, this means bint, his daughter. And Juraj is an interesting name because it actually translates as Little George, which indicates that her father was Christian. So she's likely a convert to Islam. And on her gravestone, we have the first ever reference in 691 to the Ahl al-Islam, in other words, the people of Islam. And then we have a profession of faith, and it says on it, as you can see in the translation here, and she testifies there is no deity or God except God. He alone, he has no partner, and that Muhammad is his servant and his messenger. Now, the point here is that the one from Sistan, from the east of the Islamic world, is very simple. Just there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the prophet of God. Whereas what we have in the second one, it's La ilaha illallah, and then it says Wahadahu, alone, La sharika lahu, without partner. Now, the crucial thing here is that she is this is being written for her in a Christian context. And so there's a suggestion that this emphasis on the fact that God is alone and without partner is directed at Christianity. It's saying, this is the true monotheism because, we're not confusing this idea that God can have other manifestations. And this is picked up in coins. So by 696, 697, Abdul Malik, the caliph of that time, decides to issue this extraordinary coin. Having sort of played around with representational imagery, he creates an entirely epigraphic coin, something that hadn't been done before. And right in the center of it, he places this shahada, la ilaha illallah, wahadahu, la sharika lahu. And then we have, these sort of quite militant Quranic verses located around it. So he's really taken on board the ability of coins to project ideology. And we see the same things going on in the inscriptions that are created in his most famous building. And that's what we're looking at here, which is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Now, the Dome of the Rock is dated to 72 of the Hijra, which is equivalent to 691, 692 of the Common Era. Now, that may mean that it was finished in 72, or it may mean it was actually founded in 72. And I would tend towards the latter because of various aspects of the context of the inscriptions. But either way, we've got this clear early inscription, and it's much more ambitious than anything that comes before it. It runs, as you can see on the diagram here, around the octagonal arcade inside the building, and it runs around the outside of that and the inside, and it runs for 254 meters, and it's written in mosaic. Something, again, there is no example of an Arabic inscription in mosaic before this time. So it's meant to convey some very important ideas. And I won't kind of go into too much of the detail here, but some of the things that we can note from it is that it contains the largest body of Quranic inscriptions from the 7th century. So obviously there are kind of surviving Quran manuscripts, but in terms of the use of Quran in monumental inscriptions. So there are quotes on the exterior face, and then they become much longer on the interior. There's a reference to the builder, Abdul Malik, and the date on the outside. And the other thing that we see on the outside are a series of invocations, the Bismillah, and then the Shahada, interspersed with other phrases. So as you can imagine, there's been an enormous amount of debate about what all of this is supposed to mean. And without kind of going into too much detail here, I think that what is happening is that we have an inscription that actually develops over time. So the outer face seems to have been planned and executed before the inner face was started. And the inner face then starts to deal with new ideas. But on the outside, we have these shahadas, these professions of faith, which are actually different. There are 5 of them, and they're all slightly different from one another. We have blessings on the prophet. We have also, crucially, a reference to that the community is asking for the intercession of the prophet on the Day of Judgment, the Yom al-Qiyamah. And then as we go in, we find the desire to use more ambitious and longer Quranic quotations. And many of these actually take issue with the Christian notion of Christ and of the Trinity. So you can see that there's a distinct kind of polemic which is happening here. But there's a great deal of material here. But I think the main thing is to sort of see the level of sophistication that we now have, both in terms of the text and the ideas that it's projecting, but also in the visual qualities of the script itself, because what we're seeing here is gold mosaic on a blue glass background, and so you have to really plan out the proportionality of these letter forms in order for this to be an effective device. We also see that some of the Quranic quotations, like Quran 3356, actually appear in contemporary rock inscriptions, like the ones that we've already seen. So it suggests some of these ideas are floating around at this time. So the Dome of the Rock is really a watershed in that it shows what inscriptions can do. Even though it's very experimental, it starts to show that the Quran can be used as not just a sort of a religious device, but also to develop other ideas. It's, for instance, in the way in which it engages with Christianity. And so in that sense, the Dome of the Rock looks forward to what inscriptions are going to look like on Islamic buildings for centuries to come. But at the same time, I would argue that it's fixed in a world of late antiquity, in that many of the strategies, the idea of having a religious invocation, a statement of belief, short Quranic passages, and a foundation notice at the end, is exactly what we would see in imperial inscriptions in Constantinople at the same time, but just simply in Greek. The mosaic that it's being made out of is again in a thoroughly kind of Greek late antique idiom. But the thing is that once it's there, it allows for different ways of expression. And we see full uses of Quranic quotations in the decades after the Dome of the Rock. And we can see that in rock inscriptions. And also notice the increasing kind of proportionality of these inscriptions into rock, much more controlled in character. And so I'm showing you one here, which is associated with a scribe called Uthman ibn Wahran, who we only know from his inscriptions, but there are 3 surviving, 2 from the year 80 and 1 undated. And in each case, he uses Quranic inscriptions. And this one you can see, just like the Dome of the Rock, refers to the Yom al-Qiyamah, or Day of Resurrection. And then we've got another one here which picks up on another theme in the Dome of the Rock, which is the idea of asking for the intercession of the Prophet Muhammad. This is the last of the pieces by Uthman ibn Wahran. And I mean, just a beautifully controlled inscription. But one of the really interesting things here is that the first 2 deal with the idea of the impending judgment. And it's quite clear from kind of apocalyptic literature, which has been written by Muslims, by Jews, by Samaritans, Christians, and others, is that there was a common belief that the end of time was not a distant thing, but it was actually going to come very soon. And so the Dome of the Rock kind of deals with this, and we see that in early inscriptions. But what we see in this 3rd inscription for this group that I've mentioned is perhaps a slightly more optimistic vision relating to paradise. And so, you can see this sort of invocation of paradise in this particular Quranic verse. But another crucial feature we see is that the scribe is actually now comfortable with not simply quoting, but also inserting an element from another Quranic verse into this. So it's an idea of that you can actually adapt these things to create different types of meanings. And this is something which we see later on. So I'll show you one or two examples. But there seems to me that there's a change that goes on from the 690s with the Dome of the Rock to the next great monument of the Islamic world surviving, which is the Great Mosque in Damascus, where judgment is perhaps the issue in the Dome of the Rock, and paradise becomes more of an issue in the mosaic decoration of this extraordinary structure. And we also see changes in the inscriptions as well, so that the long mosaic inscription that used to be along the prayer wall inside the building is now lost because there was a catastrophic fire within the building in the 1890s. But the thing is, we do have references to it, and here we see, sort of other types of themes, about the transcendence of God being referred to. But I think that the main point that we could draw from this is that there's a realization of just how many different things can be used through Quranic quotation, and then also subtle adjustments of Quranic verses. And so I'm showing you just one of these here, where again the scribes have the not just the control over the writing of the language, but the control over the source material to be able to make subtle changes to pronouns and to other features, so that a text can start to actually speak to its audience in a rather different way. So here again, we see, the asking of God for paradise in this inscription from 98. And this one, I mean, it's not sort of visually very impressive, but it's actually drawn onto a wall in an early Islamic palace called Qasr al-Kharani. But here, again, it's this extraordinary ability to take Quranic passages and then adapt them. So the sections that I've marked in orange here are not direct quotations, but rather using the language of the Quran and making things which are like Quranic verses. So you can see, the sort of comparisons here. And then we've got other parts marked in green, which actually are direct quotations from Quranic sources. So both the writer and the intended audience for this were obviously meant to understand, how this is working, that this isn't simply just a direct quotation, but it's engaging with, this engaging with the language of revelation in order to say things that are very specific to a particular place and time. So where does this take us in relation to kind of a late antique context? In one sense, the references to Muhammad, to this new message, all of these things are new. And I chose the title "Shock of the New" because it was actually the title of a book by Robert Hughes, an art critic, about modernist art in the 20th century. And it tried to get across this idea of, the shocking quality of cubism and other things like this. But, again, when we look at modernist art, we can often see its roots elsewhere. And I think, this is the same idea I want to sort of suggest. And, I'm looking here at an example of very early sort of old Arabic inscription. And again, it's a text where we have a Greek and an Arabic text, which are basically the same. Now, the thing is that I think what's so interesting is that the Arabic text is very uncontrolled, and it's a foundation inscription, and it's talking about a man called Sharahil ibn Talamul and the building of a tomb, a mashhad. But the thing is that the Arabic inscription ends up running across this central barrier. And yet look at the control which is exerted over the Greek inscription to be able to make do with the remaining space, and indeed be able to contract various parts of inscriptions and then also put in abbreviations, as you can see at the end of the second line, in order to cope with the space. So it shows how, anybody kind of looking at these would be at least visually aware of, these distinctions. And it reflects the fact, of course, Greek monumental inscriptions have been being put in for centuries. So they have, the practice of how to make these things work. And so we can see that in a visual sense, but I think we can also see it in terms of content. So I'm showing you here a part of a mosaic pavement of the Church of the Apostles in Mardaba in central Jordan. And in the center, we have this wonderful image of Thalassa, the personification of the sea. But around the outside, we have, and God who made the heaven and the earth give life to Anastasios and Theodora and Salamanios, the mosaicist. And, it's not a complex inscription, but what is intriguing here is that, we have essentially a sort of form of the Nicene Creed, but also it's drawing on the Psalms. And one of the things that we see in Christian inscriptions from late antiquity in this area is that the Psalms are, one of the most powerful and most quoted elements. There are actually relatively few direct quotations from the New Testament, and they mostly are Old Testament, even for Christian inscriptions. We've also got on the other side, one of the many kind of silver chalices that exist from Syria from this period. And here we actually have a foundation, well, we have an inscription mentioning the name of the patron. But the thing is that we have these references to salvation here. So we can see the same sort of things going on in our early Islamic inscriptions, that this idea of the inscription requiring salvation, intercession. These are very common themes. Now, if we think back to the inscription from Hafnat al-Abyad near Kerbala, there we had the referencing to archangels. And we have exactly the same things going on in Christian inscriptions in late antique Syria, where we have sometimes references to Christ, Michael, and Gabriel, and other kind of archangels are referenced. So it would suggest, even though we've got clearly an Arabic inscription for a Muslim client, it's something which is using something of that kind of structure of Christian inscriptions. And even things like, the basic sort of phrases like the Bismillah, in the name of God, and then also the idea of, there is no God but God, no God but Allah, the Shahada. These can be compared. There's in the Samaritan Creed is very similar in many ways, and also there are sort of Jewish formulations which are not dissimilar in terms of things like the Great Hallel. And things that what we also see in Christian inscriptions is that things like this, we're looking at the monastery of St. Catherine's in Sinai, is that we see this use of the term in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And scholars like Sean Leatherberry have actually talked about this almost like a Christian brand, which is being propagated by Justinian across the empire. And so, you can imagine how, things like, sort of the Bismillah is in many ways a kind of Muslim response to that. So what I think we can see is that there are all sorts of strategies, literary, also formulations of words that we see in Christian inscriptions that seem to kind of find similar forms in Islam. The quoting of the Psalms is rather similar to the types of short Quranic phrases which are used in these early inscriptions, which again have this sort of rather kind of generalized quality, very different from the kind of very precise legalistic nature of some of the later Quranic verses, what's called the Medinan verses. And then we've also got strategies of placement and visual qualities. The mosaics, these mosaic inscriptions in the Dome of the Rock, like the ones we see in late antique churches, are placed very high up in the building and require you to kind of circuit around the structure to be able to read them. And we even have from the site of Kasr West, a palace from the 720s, an example of an inscription where the stone was drilled into because it was designed to actually have bronze lettering, probably gilded, which was placed into the stone, which is exactly what we see in Roman inscriptions. So again, mostly lost, but we can see those also continuing into the Byzantine world. So it's not to suggest that these early Islamic inscriptions are not important for telling us about that world and also important for what comes later. But I think that in order to properly understand them, we need to think about their strategies. So just to kind of finish off on that particular point, this is the site of Shiftaus in modern day Israel. And it's a late antique settlement that continues into Islam. It was probably predominantly Christian. We have churches there, but there's also a mosque. And this mosque was sort of put in the early 8th century. And we have a whole series of inscriptions associated with it. Now, what's really interesting about them is that they choose entirely different Quranic verses from what we see in the Great Mosque in Damascus or the Dome of the Rock. So it shows that people were choosing things that were appropriate. And there's a very sort of well-chosen passage which talks about what people of faith have to do, and it has a sort of ecumenical quality to it, in that it doesn't specify one faith, but rather all the people who are following God. And it's a very kind of diplomatic selection in a kind of majority Christian town. And so I think that, again, we can see how particular Quranic verses are being used for very specific purposes. So the very last sort of area I'm going to cover, because I should sort of wrap up, is in sort of Syria, Egypt, all of these areas around the kind of Eastern Mediterranean, we see inscriptions being used from the 7th century onwards, and then they become just a standard and ubiquitous feature of early Islamic architecture. If we go east and we go into the Sasanian territories of eastern Iraq and Iran and into Central Asia, there's a very curious thing, which is that there are no surviving monumental inscriptions before the 10th century. And I'm showing you kind of a couple of examples here. One from a doorway of an ancient mosque in Isfahan, dating to the 960 to 85. And then we've got a graffito, which was placed into the ancient site of Persepolis by a Buyid ruler in 955 to 56. And while we can always say, well, maybe it's just simply we haven't found earlier inscriptions, and indeed we do have inscriptions on objects and textiles and so on, it is at least odd that we have nothing from these earlier phases. It does suggest at the very minimum that it doesn't seem to have been a very popular activity. So the question then is, if we go back into late antiquity but into that Persian past, do we see something different? I'm showing you here another beautiful example. This is from the Masjid-i-Jami in Na'in, the congregational mosque it's a little town not far away from Isfahan, and this has say a beautiful stucco work within it, and you can see this inscription with a blue background kind of which runs around the little dome at the central part of the building. So why the late emergence of these inscriptions? And I think that it makes sense when we go back to the Sasanian past. So the Sasanian dynasty ruled between 223 and then were toppled in the early 7th century, and the last Sasanian ruler died in 651. But you have to really struggle to find visually impressive inscriptions, monumental inscriptions, because the Sasanian world was so visual. They used rock carvings of rulers and royal investitures and battle scenes and hunting and so on. And then they also are famous for silver plates that again show royal hunting. But where a silver plate that was produced in Syria might have a visual image on it, but it would have a great big inscription running around the outside of it, absent from these. Also, although there are tiny inscriptions on some of these rock reliefs, they're very, you don't really see them. You know, they're not a visually prominent part of the design, and sometimes they're altogether absent. And this is one of the few kind of monumental inscriptions. It's a trilingual inscription on this freestanding structure that you can see here. So what I would argue is that, you know, each of these areas, you know, provided different strategies. And so when we actually look at the monumental inscriptions that from the 10th century onwards, and then particularly into the 11th, they become very common and prominent. And I'm showing you a couple of early examples of tomb towers, and they have concentric inscriptions on them, sort of running around, just as, you know, we see in buildings elsewhere. And of course, we can go back to the Dome of the Rock as a fundamental example of that. But there's a question here as to, you know, is this where this comes from? You know, is it actually drawing on the Dome of the Rock, or is it drawing on something else? And if we look around what's going on in the sort of this period in the 11th century, we might just as well actually look to Constantinople. And just by way of comparison, we can see that in Constantinople, we have this idea of exterior inscriptions, which are running in bands around. And again, if you look carefully, you can see this was drilled, so almost certainly did have bronze lettering in it, set into it originally. And then we also have, perhaps rather less sort of visually impressive, but still very interesting, examples of Armenian churches that have exterior inscriptions on them. So it would suggest to me that, you know, in Iran, they're looking elsewhere. They're not looking to that sort of late antique Mediterranean past, but perhaps to other sources for visual inspiration. So just to kind of wrap up, I mean, I think what this comes to is that, you know, we can certainly be looking at inscriptions for what they say, and that's tremendously important. But when we start to broaden it out and we start to think about these inscriptions as visual objects, as things that are made as well, we start to understand them in different ways. We can also think about their spatial context. I showed an example earlier on from a piece near Mecca, and it's actually cut into a place where you could sit next to it, and there are references to shelter, you know, as a Quranic references to shelter. And it suggests that sometimes the actual landscape features around an inscription might be part of their meaning, just as, you know, in the Dome of the Rock, you know, the placement of them in a particular place that requires you to walk around the building becomes part of the overall meaning as much as what those words actually have to say. So we can do that for, you know, late antique and for early Islamic inscriptions. And I would suggest that, you know, when we're looking at the Dome of the Rock and these early inscriptions, you know, they do suggest directions forward, but at the same time, we should think of them as grounded in, you know, that sort of late antique tradition. So, thank you. Sorry, I realize I spoke a little bit long, but I hope that's okay.
That's fine. So maybe I should start off with questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay, good. I was interested in what you said about the ability of writers to use Quranic phrases and play with them in a way and change them. Insert some actual quotes, but then have other text. So these are not variants of Quranic texts that are not yet codified, but they are actually original phrasing, basically.
Yeah, it's a very good point. There has been debate. I mean, for instance, in the Dome of the Rock, that some of the Quranic verses there are in fact sort of additions by the Umayyad dynasty, and that the final form of the Quran doesn't exist until the early part of the 8th century. But at the same time, others, there's a scholar called Nicholas Sinai who wrote a couple of very long articles where essentially he argued that by the time of Uthman in the 640s, that what he calls the consonantal skeleton of the Quran is complete. And that I don't think we can ever prove these things, but one of the things that's important in that respect is the Quranic fragments, excuse me, the Quranic manuscript fragments that were found in the Great Mosque in Sana'a in the Yemen show that actually at least the ones from the late 7th century seem to accord fairly much with the Quran as we know it today. But there is one manuscript among those which dates to the 660s, but it is itself a palimpsest, and using infrared light, they found the kind of text that was scraped away underneath it. And that one does have divergent readings in it. They're not big by any means. I mean, it's sort of a difference in, a consonant here and there, and whether there's a long vowel and things like that. So to me, I mean, it probably is likely that the Quran was somewhat stable by the time of the Dome of the Rock, for instance. But even in the Dome of the Rock, you do see slight pronoun changes, and I think that would not be appropriate in a Quranic manuscript, but it probably is appropriate in an inscription because it doesn't have quite the same status. So I think that's why there is that freedom to do that, and in fact, you see that throughout the Islamic period, that there are in monumental inscriptions sometimes just slight changes. That there's a real interest also in these early inscriptions with trying to involve the reader, because there are ones where it says not just "I testify that" something, but it says "see this and testify." It's trying to make you as the reader do things. So I think that accounts for some of these kind of pronoun shifts, that they're trying to make it more immediate in character. So but I mean, going back to this question of whether there are variant readings, I mean, there are Muslim traditions that that Uthman tried to destroy all of the variants that he knew of, and there was I think a man called Ibn Mas'ud who refused to give his version, and then there are suggestions that this continued to exist, but I think it's still difficult to know for sure. But I would tend towards the idea that probably by the mid 7th century there's a fairly kind of stable text. Yeah.
Stephen, yeah.
Thank you. That's a wonderful talk this evening, Professor Millwright. I'm curious how this all looks in a largely illiterate world. I assume that it's illiterate, and so do you think that? So I'm thinking about. I was thinking about coins originally, and when images disappear from coins in the Islamic world, well, then you've got a problem. You don't have your sort of the propagandistic function of the image anymore in coins. It goes back to Greek and Roman times, of course. So do you think that people could recognize something like the Shahada, even though they wouldn't be able to read, they would recognize the letter shapes and could see that that's what it was, say on a coin or on an inscription, and recognize it for what it was, even though they were not literate. And in addition to that, I was wondering what your thoughts on, if the development of a calligraphy early on in Islam was related to the need to help people recognize the letter, the words, even though they couldn't read.
Yeah, I think it's a really important issue. I mean, clearly levels of literacy must have been relatively low,
Yeah.
and you brought up the example of the coin, and we have from the sort of 650s onwards, they start to produce what are called Arab Sasanian and Arab Byzantine coins, things that look almost like they're prototypes, but just with kind of a little bit of Bismillah or something around the edge. And then by the 680s, they're starting to adapt those images and try and come up with their own. And so there's a sort of image warfare going on between the Byzantine world and the Umayyads. But Abdul Malik, I think, quite rightly realizes that it's just not going to work. That the thing is that you can't adapt these things ultimately and make them into something really compelling, whereas text was going to do that job really well. And so with the gold coin, clearly most people would not have been able to read it. But what they would have been able to see is that it just didn't look anything like anything else. I mean, it
doesn't have an image.
Yeah, it's so different. And also he minted it with a higher level of gold purity to make it very attractive as well. So it was very widely circulated.
Yeah.
But I think that your point about some of the kind of key phrases, the Bismillah and the Shahada, I think that yes, through sheer repetition, these probably were, people understood what they were. And then the other thing is that that there's been some very interesting work on how people read, and in the Greek world and elsewhere, is that there was a practice of reading out loud.
Right.
And so if you were actually going around a building looking at inscriptions and you could read them, you would be reading them out loud. And so other people around you, could be kind of functionally literate because they would get to know what it was you were saying. So I think there are different ways in inscriptions work, but I think the other thing is that they work visually, and that's why I think the proportionality of script, the need to create, for calligraphers to create particular scripts for writing the Quran was so important.
I have another question, if I may just ask you about the inscriptions on the formerly Egyptian churches. They were in Arabic, and they actually refer directly to, like in a maybe polemic way, to Christian tenets of belief, right? Saying that God is actually alone and doesn't have a partner and so on. Could it be expected, apart from the fact that we don't know whether people could actually read Arabic, do we know that they spoke Arabic at that point?
It probably depend on where you are. I mean, within sort of Syria, Greater Syria, there would have been a lot of Greek and Aramaic, and the thing is that when we look at the Dome of the Rock, that was actually being decorated by Christian craftsmen. There were clearly kind of mosaic schools operating in these areas, and indeed what I found from working on the inscriptions was that the first part of the Arabic inscription, they laid it in backwards, because the thing is that they were used to laying inscriptions in the other way round.
Right.
And so what you see is that the inscription gradually contracts as it gets towards the beginning because they were running out of space. So they had to kind of squidge up the letters. So sorry, that's a slight kind of tangent from what you were talking about, but sorry, remind me of precisely.
So were they bilingual, that they could actually understand the polemic directed at the Christians?
Well, that's the thing, is when we look at the inscription in the Dome of the Rock, it's inside the building, and I don't think that there was free access into the Dome of the Rock, so it's an inscription that works really much better for the Umayyad elite who put it in there, and that's where propaganda, when we use it, that sort of term, kind of in a modern idea, it's not how that works in a kind of medieval context. I mean, a lot of these meanings are really for the dynasty themselves, much more than they are for propagating them outside. That's what coins obviously work in a very different way. But I think it's interesting that, you know, the Dome of the Rock is trying out ideas, and then, you know, a few years later he's putting it onto a coin in a much more condensed way. Now, who could actually read it? Probably not very many people, but we know that, you know, at that time, you know, there were religious debates going on. I mean, Christians refer to the fact that they are having to kind of defend their beliefs against Muslims. So I think that it's part of a kind of bigger phenomenon.
There's definitely an exchange going on between the two faiths.
Yeah.
I mean, I looked at some point. I know there were dialogues written. I know only the Christian side, really, written by Christians, where they're trying to defend this kind of in a setting where Christian scholars are arguing with Islamic scholars.
Yeah, definitely. Robert, I can see your hand up.
Yes, thank you for a very interesting talk. And I too was quite struck by these inscriptions that seem to almost be arguing or even sort of correcting Christian doctrine with some of these very pointed inscriptions. And I wonder if it might be possible even to think about those a little bit differently, because I think that some of these areas like Egypt and Syria, some of the Christians living in those areas, so to speak, may also have had some issues with the Christian Trinity, because there's quite a lot of, as you know, communities of Monophysites, Christian communities that really stress and emphasize that God has only one nature. And I wonder if some of these Arabic inscriptions that sort of seem to go out of their way to stress that God has no helper, in a way, to some degree kind of align a little bit with that sort of belief that might have been present in quite a lot of the Christian communities, that might also care to stress the exclusively divine nature of the Christian deity. And so I wonder if maybe, you know, to whatever degree there were these kinds of dialogues taking place, I wonder if it might be a little bit that it's not just Muslim versus Christian, but in a way that these Muslim inscriptions are in essence taking a side in some of these Christian disputes, or in essence sort of lending support to perhaps what might have been the prevailing Christian view on the ground in some of these places.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, and you're quite right. I mean, Christianity is certainly not a monolithic phenomenon at that point, and I think there is kind of engagement with, you know, Monophysite belief. I mean, I'm struck also in a little bit later we start to see the sort of iconoclastic damage within churches, and that appears to be done not by Muslims coming in and damaging churches, but within Christian communities, and I think that, you know, this uncertainty about the legitimacy of the image, you know, is something which is splitting Christianity again, you know, between kind of Diphysite and Monophysite, and we can see the similar things. Judaism is going through a kind of iconoclastic phase in synagogue mosaics as well. So yeah, I mean, I think I mean, it bears very much on that inscription of Abasa bint Juraj from Aswan, where, you know, she says, you know, that there's the first inscription where it says, I testify that, you know, God is alone without partner, you know, and is it simply, you know, sort of dividing herself from the Christians, or is, you know, maybe there's a more complex message there, you know, sort of, you know, depending on the kind of Christian communities that were there were in Aswan. I don't know enough about what's happening in kind of southern Egypt at that time, but yeah, that would be well worth kind of looking into further. Yeah.
So might they actually have taken sides in the debates to show that maybe their view of God is like the kind of view of God that these Christians actually want, and maybe they should just, convert to Islam?
Well, one of the debates that has gone on is, traditionally it was kind of thought that the armies of conquest were all kind of converts to Islam, that it was Muslims, going out and fighting, and clearly that must have been the case, that there were plenty of converts. But at the same time, there seems to be suggestions that actually it was an army of conquest that was made up of whoever wanted to be part of it, because there are obviously economic benefits as well. And so, yeah, I mean, I think when it's say in the Dome of the Rock, where it's engaging with Christianity, I mean, it does say, very explicit things like, it talks about the nature of Jesus, that, he's a prophet and, not the son of God. It says, say not three, it is better for you. So it's taking issue with, Christianity, but it seems to be also taking issue with Constantinople. I mean, it's not just religious but political there, and so maybe they're less concerned with local Christian groups and more with the major Christian power of the time. But I think one of the issues though is, I mean, the fragmentation of kind of Christianity in that part of the world is very complicated, and again, there have been some interesting articles about the emergence of iconoclasm, and there, again, there are these groups that are just so difficult to track. We know them by their names sometimes, and there's very little else to link them with actual physical stuff.
If I may actually ask one more time about the iconoclasm, we recently had an exhibit in our Halifut Museum of early Islamic coins. And it seems that there are some strands, maybe at least, of Islam that didn't worry about icons on or images on coins at all. Can you comment on those two?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the thing is that the Islamic kind of iconoclasm is very limited in the sense that there's very little evidence for them actually actively destroying Christian icons or anything like that. They did take issue with the cross, and they didn't like, so there are quite a number of examples of processional crosses and crosses on churches being destroyed, and it came down to the fact that what the cross represented was the death and the resurrection of Christ, which went against the Muslim vision. And then there are references to, in the biographies of the Prophet, that when the Kaaba was retaken in 629, that he ordered the walls to be sort of, all the images on the walls to be taken away, the pagan deities or idols, whatever they were, to be taken out, smashed. And then he said, destroy everything except what is under my hands. And under his hands, according to this account, was a painting of the Virgin and Child. And this apparently stayed in the Kaaba until the 690s. So yeah, there doesn't seem to be kind of a great worry about images other than in the very particular context of being in a mosque or being in a Quranic manuscript or something like that. And yeah, in coinage, you get this shift to the epigraphic coins, but then you have in some parts of an area called Tabaristan in the sort of south of the Caspian Sea, they continued to make sort of Sasanian style coins for another century. So we're through to the 680s, 780s. They're making these Sasanian images. And the last one in that series is really interesting because instead of having you've got the Sasanian crown, and then the shoulders, but they've turned the head into a diamond with a circle in it. It's become an abstract theme. And is that a form of iconoclasm, or is it just simply that sort of embrace of geometry, and the thing that we associate with Islamic culture? But the number of examples of active iconoclasm are relatively small. More once they get to India and they're sort of encountering kind of Buddhist and Hindu images, and it starts to, I think, because those religions are not seen as scriptural religions, they don't have the same kind of legal protections. But it's not, yes, it's not a kind of fundamentally very iconoclastic religion. It's more of an aniconic one.
That makes sense. Are there any other questions? I didn't want to, you know, just be the only one asking. Well, then I think it remains for us to thank you for a wonderful talk. I learned a lot of new and interesting things and saw a lot of interesting images. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, well,
yeah, well, thank you.
Wish you a good evening, and it's been lovely to be